Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Paul, and what I want to do in this video is give a response to Alex O'Connor's video, This is Why I Don't Believe in God. I believe this video was actually part of a debate that was hosted in 2022. So really, Alex took that part of his debate and uploaded it as its own video called This is Why I Don't Believe in God. I really like Alex O'Connor as a YouTuber. He's one of my favorite YouTubers, formerly Cosmic Skeptic. I think he's really thoughtful. I respect him a lot. And what I wanted to do is just kind of address his points from a Christian perspective. And hopefully what'll come out of this is a productive discussion. Alex, if you're watching this, hi. But yeah, hopefully we can keep the conversation going. I think he brings up some good points that aren't easily necessarily answered. And I'm not claiming to have a definitive rebuttal or refutation of them as much as just being able to offer a Christian perspective or a Christian response. So let's go ahead and get started. The main points that Alex gives, and this is, I guess, more of his opening statement, is he gives three reasons for accepting atheism or naturalism. He gives divine hiddenness, the geographical distribution of religious belief, which maybe you could argue is a subset of divine hiddenness, but I actually like that Alex brought this on its own point because I think it kind of stands separately. And lastly, the problem of evil. And I want to talk specifically about mostly divine hiddenness. I will talk about these other ones, but especially the problem of evil. I feel like I have at least addressed this in other videos, so I don't want to be rehashing too much, but I will address it at least a little bit. So what is divine hiddenness? Well, it's basically the idea that God, if God exists, why is his existence not obvious? Why do we have to maybe some people would say seek God to know that he even exists in the first place, let alone know that he's like a loving sort of God, these sorts of things. I really think this is the most compelling point that Alex gives, and it's also when he's at his most vulnerable. And I will also say I think I can relate to this to the extent that I've felt abandoned by God in the past, and I've had years, literally years of my life that I was skeptical. And yet here I am as somebody who identifies as a Christian, and obviously I found something. I found what I believe is God, and it's honestly made my life, just completely turned it around and made it great. And yeah, I guess I can talk a little bit about that. So usually the argument for divine hiddenness goes like this. Premise 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. And the conclusion, therefore God does not exist. I think if you're going to attack this, because notice how this is already restricting our view of God to the Judeo-Christian God, which I mean, I appreciate, right? We're not considering that if God exists, he could be impersonal or deistic or something. We're really defining terms, and this is why I think this is a very good argument. What I really want to focus on right now is premise 2. If a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. And the first question we need to ask, and we're going to get into epistemology, what does it mean to actually believe in God? Or what does it mean to know God? Does God want us to believe he exists in some sort of propositional way? Like I assent positively to the belief that God exists. Or, and this is kind of my challenge, does God want a more personal experience, perhaps something more transcendent or something not able to be pinned down by sort of the laws or rules of I don't want to say not pinned down by the laws and rules of logic, but in some way something indescribably good, perhaps. And to which I would say, what if looking for God through propositional arguments is like looking for love in all the wrong places? And I really want to come back to this point in a minute, but I at least want you to think about this, that if God does exist, and it's not just a matter of believing in God propositionally, which is kind of with our 21st century Western philosophical blinders on, but like believing in or trusting in or like having a personal relationship, like not like belief as positive assent, but belief as in like, I know he's got my back kind of thing, then maybe we can restructure this argument in a way that's, I would argue, at least more charitable to Christianity. And I think, yeah, this is kind of the main problem here. And I think there's a tendency when looking at arguments for God to focus too much on our sort of mental or brain-like processes and not on like the personal or matters of the heart. I think the mental arguments are really important. But this is where I think sometimes apologists can make this mistake and fail because they focus too much on arguments in this abstract realm and not on the sort of personal experience of belief. And this is where, in particular, I'll eventually kind of give a challenge to Alex in terms of what, from my perspective, he could be doing differently for seeking God. But I say this because Alex certainly knows. I mean, he studied theology and philosophy. He certainly knows, or I would argue, it seems like he knows the arguments for God's existence better than probably most theists or most Christians do. Yet something isn't clicking. And the question we need to ask is why? And what does that imply? Does that mean that God doesn't exist, which is what Alex seems to imply? Or does it simply mean that he's looking for the existence of God in an area that is only one potential argument for the existence of God, which is weird because that kind of becomes self-referential, but at least one potential place people come to believe in God, and there could be others. This is where I want to talk a little bit about Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard makes an interesting distinction between a genius and an apostle, and this is the problem that apologists can make, is they end up looking like a really smart person who can articulate arguments very well and even win over a large mass. And that's different from actually being an apostle, which is somebody whose purpose is to serve or to teach, as opposed to a genius being somebody who is looking for sort of their own glory. And at a certain point, I think this even becomes non-Christian because you are making a God out of yourself, and rather than serving God, and to a certain extent. And this is the point I know Craig makes, a lot of people make. We use arguments for God to help us explain our own personal experience with God. But for those of us who have experienced personally God, I mean, I think there's something ineffable about it, something we can't really put into arguments. And we try to use arguments as a way to communicate or as a means to communicate. But at the end of the day, when we claim we've had some sort of experience with the divine or something like that, I don't think this is something that, I think even being able to reduce it to a set of propositions on a piece of paper would in some ways be losing something. And that's because these arguments fail to take into account our own religious experience, and they cannot, because having to write it down is losing something in translation. This is the point that Penner makes. He has a really interesting book called The End of Apologetics. It says it like this: the ethos of modernity is defined by secularity, in which the existence of God is not intuitively plausible, and the reasons we have for believing in God, or anything else, must be objective, universal, and neutral. But if God exists, what I want to challenge is, why must we have objective, universal, and neutral reasons to justify that? Our own reason for believing that objective, universal, and neutral reasons are a good thing come back to our own personal experience in the first place. This is not to argue some weird, like, I'm not trying to go off on the deep end and argue that belief in God is somehow irrational, as perhaps the Fides would say. Rather, I would argue that if God exists, God is the source of truth. He is like truer than true. So any of our ways of trying to describe this are going to be imperfect imitations of it. Penner has another really interesting quote. He talks about apologetic positivism, that Christian beliefs must be demonstrably rational to be accepted. And otherwise, if you can't rationally demonstrate them, you shouldn't believe in them. Here's the really, really interesting point that Penner makes. The problem with modern apologetics is that Christian thought has already given up far too much by merely acknowledging and responding to the modern challenges to Christian belief, as if these objections had any sort of claim on the legitimacy of faith, pretty much in the first place. What Penner's arguing is that if Christianity is true, if God exists, then there's no reason to expect that one needs to have arguments for God's existence. I mean, obviously you would expect, now this doesn't solve the problem of divine hiddenness, but it just is basically saying you can't show that theism is false, that theism is irrational without somehow showing that it's false in the first place, and somehow proposing some other sort of epistemology that would explain these sorts of things. Now, this doesn't basically solve the problem of divine hiddenness, because if somebody hasn't found God, they're going to challenge the legitimacy of faith because of their own lack of experience, especially if they have been seeking, as Alex O'Connor claims he has been. The point that I agree with Penner on, and I don't agree with everything in his book, but the point I do agree with him on is that Christianity then is much more a way or an invitation to live or walk or grow in truth than it is a doctrine or set of beliefs or a position whose truth we can grasp and cognitively master, as perhaps the modern apologetic paradigm seems to imply, which is itself perhaps a product of modernity, a product of Enlightenment thought. And the point that I want to say is, look, if this is true, is it any surprise that someone who tries really hard, and this isn't going after Alex at all, but just basically anyone who tries to study theology or approach Christianity from a head perspective and not a heart or a personal perspective is going to struggle. This was, I think, the mistake that I made. I felt like, oh man, I'm struggling in my belief. I need to look at arguments so I can defend it. But at a certain point, you realize that this is so inauthentic. You're looking for reasons that can ground your own experience. But what the problem is that perhaps you feel alone, or you feel abandoned by God, or you're afraid that God doesn't exist. At least this was my experience. And as a result, I think I ended up becoming a skeptic because I was looking for arguments in these sorts of places. My response to somebody like Alex, who has done more than enough reasonable work looking for God from using mental faculties and things, is like, try volunteering. It's kind of an odd thing, but like literally try helping other people. Read stuff that is uplifting. One of my favorite books, Father Gregory Boyle's Tattoos on the Heart. Had to read this book actually for secular class at secular university. We had to read it, and I love that book. I just recently read it again. And the question I want to ask is, does this book stir anything in you? Does living this out have anything that's meaningful or that speaks to you in any sort of way that perhaps isn't something that's, I'm not saying it's impossible to propositionalize it, but it's more difficult to propositionalize it. Could it be possible? Perhaps that's the question, or that's the challenge, that we're looking for a personal relationship, or we're looking for evidence of something that is personal in something that by definition is impersonal, and thus are committing a category error. We're looking for a relationship with God in propositional existence, in propositions that are, by modernity standards, supposed to be and will be impersonal. And for me personally, this is what happened. I only really found that Christianity was true, or I finally got it, when I finally started living my life as if it was true and helping others. That's really where it began to start taking meaning and shaping meaning for me. And it was not an immediate process for me. It took time. It took me, looking at arguments, but also just living it out and putting myself in that experience. I have no reason to doubt the legitimacy of O'Connor's authenticity in seeking God and not finding him. And I would also say, and perhaps this is controversial, I think he would be pragmatically justified in not believing there is a God if he has tried these suggestions of other believers. Not logically justified, but pragmatically justified to say, hey, look, why would the next thing somebody suggests to me work? I've tried all this other stuff. When can I give up? That's a fair point. But for somebody like myself, who is going to be biased because I claim I have had a divine experience, I do have an a priori reason for skepticism about the naturalistic theories of religious belief. Because keep in mind, O'Connor is not just saying, therefore, I don't believe in God. He is accepting a position, naturalism and atheism, that undermines all religious believers' belief. And as a result, somebody like myself, who claims I have had a religious belief, and who does think naturalistic theories sort of fail to take this into account, or do a poor job at explaining the nature of my own religious belief, which cannot be put into words or cannot be necessarily propositionalized, I'm, of course, going to be skeptical of the counterclaim or the sort of counter-metaphysical position that's offered. And I have been really skeptical. I mean, I was skeptical of a lot of things. External world, morality, even like reason. It's like, what reasons do I have to trust reason? I went through all of this stuff. And yet, at a certain point, I do think I found God. But I almost had to go through all of this stuff, I think, to really sort of reorient myself and really just shake what I thought I believed. So somebody who has found God and claims that this is open to Alex, right? I'm not just claiming, okay, God exists and he somehow picked me, but a non-sort of Calvinist idea that like God exists and yes, he also wants to have a relationship with somebody like Alex. I'm going to have to claim either one, that Alex is looking in the wrong place, or two, that he's not sincerely looking, period. Now, I don't want to doubt the legitimacy. Once again, I'm saying I'm not doubting the legitimacy of O'Connor's authenticity, but somebody who would challenge point number two, and I'm almost hesitated to even bring this up, but I think Alex of all people would understand and perhaps give charity to this, would understand that why somebody like myself would not doubt the authenticity of O'Connor's authenticity, or doubt the legitimacy of O'Connor's authenticity, but perhaps be skeptical of it. And this is because Alex O'Connor is a YouTuber who has in some part made a name for himself and a reputation for being a religious skeptic. He has videos from 7 years ago, probably before he even went to university, having some sort of anti-religious content. Now, like I said, I don't dispute the fact that Alex went around and really claimed, okay, I'm going to try this out for myself. But it's difficult, or at least I would like Alex to see why I would be skeptical of claims to sincerity when it's like, was there ever a point you're like, I'm going to renounce me being a skeptic and really try this out to know if it's true or not? And this is why I think it is sometimes difficult for us as believers who, come with this already biased view. This is not meant to be a psychoanalysis or anything like that, but instead to say, would this contribute potentially to somebody being unable to sincerely look, that they have their identity tied so much to being right, to being a skeptic, to something like this, rather than that could potentially, I would ask it as a question, not even say it as a statement or an argument, but is it possible that this could impede your own view of looking for truth? That's kind of the question that I would want to ask. Lastly, I want to talk about divine hiddenness and epistemology. If somebody told me, okay, this so-and-so likes you, it would be strange for me if I immediately created hoops for them to jump through to actually demonstrate this. Now, I think where the non-believer is going to have a good point is to say, well, you have to believe they exist in the first place if you could believe they like you, right? Somebody's like, yeah, there's like a leprechaun sitting over here that has a crush on you. I'm obviously going to be like, okay, let them like demonstrate their existence to me first, regardless. But we're talking about God. We're not talking about a leprechaun. I say this because when I was a skeptic, or when I was skeptical, once again, I'm not claiming this is what O'Connor's doing or anything like that, but when I was a skeptic, I was trying to put my own conditions on what was reasonable evidence and demand God would meet these conditions. And I had it backwards, if you think about it, right? First of all, what right did I have to put this on God? But to be fair, I think you can argue, okay, if God exists and I'm making an effort to honestly seek God, shouldn't he also meet me halfway or acknowledge that I'm at least like trying? And I think that's a fair point, right? To say, God, I've been trying, I've been doing all this stuff. Can I have some acknowledgement that I'm at least going in the right direction or going in the wrong direction because all I feel is silence? That's fair. But I think what I failed to take into account was that if God exists, my very faculties of reason and the existence of reason itself would be contingent on his existence. And what I was doing in looking for rational arguments for God's existence was trying to place God in a subservient role to the things he created. I'm like, God, I am going to believe in you if you demonstrate your existence to me on my own terms and basically like put yourself inside of your own, creation and demonstrate that to me. And what kind of God would that be? But then you could argue God actually did that. He actually did that and became Jesus, if you're a Christian. And kind of realizing the demand I was expecting to place on God was something he had kind of in some ways already done and already demonstrated. And it was a very humbling experience for me to realize, for me, like what exactly I was doing. And this is in some ways how I came to at least reorient myself to a different epistemology. I guess I would put it that way. Anyway, the next point I want to talk about, and this goes back into the sort of geographical or social distribution of religious belief, once again, just in the same way that somebody who is at a Christian university is probably going to be less likely to even become an atheist or denounce their theism, even if they felt like it. One could argue, okay, somebody in a primarily skeptical or anti-religious set of beliefs is probably going to be less likely to be able to consider the truth of Christianity if it is true. You can argue these from groupthink, from sociology, these sorts of things. But moving on to this point, I think what we can do is write this as a syllogism. So premise one goes like this. If God exists, we expect a uniform distribution of belief across geography, or relatively uniform perhaps. Premise two, there is not a uniform distribution of belief across geography. Conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. And I think, obviously, where you're going to want to come at this, if you're a theist, is going to be premise one. You're going to say, why assume that there would need to be why assume that there would be a uniform distribution of belief across geography? Another thing that this happens is that it assumes that identifying as a Christian, what we receive from the results of these studies, is the same as responding to some sort of inner invitation, which could possibly happen with uniform frequency across all geographies. So you could even challenge it on that point. But then, of course, you can also just challenge it conceptually too, not just methodologically, but on a conceptual claim. You could suggest, why would we expect a uniform distribution across religious belief? Perhaps the culture that you're raised in has an effect on whether or not you are willing to do this, and that's okay. I think this is a strong point when you make the evidential case. I think when you write it as a logical case, it's very easy where you can push back. But the evidential case would go like this. If God exists, it is unlikely we would see the amount of religious diversity we do, or it is unlikely that religious belief would be so well predicted by geographical location. Therefore, it is unlikely that God exists. I think this is the way you would structure that argument if you were going to make it. And I think in this case, it's quite a bit stronger. The first thing I would say is we still don't know, and the Bible actually talks about this, that people are going to be judged based on what they do know. So we don't really know to the extent that these people who claim religious affiliation, once again, we're equating the claims of religious affiliation with the actual incidents of knowing God or being saved. It could be that people in more Christian areas are more likely to go along with Christian belief and not actually have an authentic Christian belief. So that's one way I think you could poke a hole at this. There's another fact too that Jesus talks about the fact that many are going to claim to know me, but only those who do the will of my Father are going to be those that see me in heaven. Of course, then you get to ask the question, what does it mean to do the will of God? These sorts of things. To which I say, I found it if I go out and volunteer, go out and help people, and that's I think what James said. Visiting widows and orphans, these sorts of things. Just go out and do what you think would make the world a better place. And I hope that something speaks to you as it did for me. That's all I can ask for. However, I think this is the other problem, going back to this argument, that's neither here nor there, is that an objection about the geographical distribution of religious belief seems to be even more damning for naturalism. Now, why do I say this? Look at the geographical distribution of naturalism or atheism itself, right? What does this end up implying? Only those in wealthy Western and predominantly white countries are able to reach metaphysical truths, or that they're able to reach metaphysical truths at a much higher rate than those from other countries or other geographies around the world. And I would say there's certainly much more religious assent between somebody who's a Christian, a Jew, and a Sikh versus somebody who's a naturalist, right? So this idea of there being a geographical distribution of naturalistic belief, if this is an objection against theistic belief, this would also in some ways be undercut the idea of naturalistic belief. Now, I think this is not meant to be an argument from authority. It's what it's instead meant to be asked as is, if God cares so much about people, why does it seem like some people have a better chance at knowing God than others do? Like, I think that's really the heart of the issue. Like, if God claims to show no impartiality and love everybody, why is it that some people are exposed to the gospel more so than others? To which I would claim, I think that God loves everybody equally, and just because some people are exposed to the gospel, if God is all good and all loving and all knowing and all these sorts of things, then he's going to know the right balance of where to, show up to people. And number two, people can respond to their own sort of inner light in their heart. It's the idea of, would presenting the gospel necessarily to a non-believer in any way, which is an interesting point, make it any more likely that they would become a Christian? Now, then that brings up the other issue, right, of why do we even need to evangelize if that's the case? And I would argue that maybe it has some dependence on us, or at least maybe we can do our own part in sharing the gospel, and this is good, and this is sort of part of God's plan. So I think all of these options are open. It's like God judges people based on what they know, but it is good for us to take part in teaching other people, because it's not just that we should let people like only be judged on what they know. We should teach them truth and goodness so that they're able to be judged on a much higher range of things, and they have the capability to understand and know God, and that itself is a very good thing. It is a good thing for us, and it is a good thing for them. So we get to actually take part in this sort of process, and that, once again, being part of the good of that. So that's kind of how I would respond. Lastly, what I want to do is talk a little bit about gratuitous suffering, which is the third point that Alex brought up. So the thing I want to mention first is obviously I've talked about this before, and you can see a video that I was responding to a conversation between Majesty of Reason and Trent Horn, where I talked a little bit more about gratuitous suffering. So I don't want to repeat myself too much, but just kind of giving a possible or sketching out a response here I think would be helpful. Once again, I think Alex's version of God is a very Bentham or Mill type of utilitarian who's trying to minimize suffering. And if we see suffering as having some sort of telos or purpose, not just the purpose of causing, its purpose in natural selection, which, works both under naturalism and theism if diversity is a good thing, but also just suffering being used to serve some sort of goal. You could argue it serves some sort of purpose, and God allows it to bring about greater good. So, you could argue suffering serves a purpose. It did for Jesus, and God uses suffering to create life and sustain the diversity of life, and suffering not necessarily being a bad thing in and of itself, at least not when it's used for something greater. I think, there's a difference between suffering that leads to growth and gratuitous suffering. And the other thing you can say, right, if God values growth, then our comfort is not as valuable as strength and free will and how we respond to suffering. And then once again, using a free will defense for suffering to say that, hey, in many cases, as the Buddhists would say, pain is inevitable, suffering is a choice. Many cases we choose to sort of wallow in our own suffering, when sometimes just, in a very stoic or Buddhist or Christian type of way, it's just saying well, hey, I can actually choose to respond and not be in conscious torment, and that being a use of free will, and that use of free will actually being a good thing, to not sort of wallow in self-pity or continual suffering. And the other thing you could say too, God provides us with strength and comfort in our sufferings. Paul talks about this. A lot of other people, who have been struck with natural disasters and other things will say, hey, it really felt like God was there for me, or was there supporting me. And to the point that I think if someone's in a position where they're suffering a lot and they don't see, or they don't feel the presence of God, and they're going through some tremendous suffering, I think my initial response is, well, let's look at what's going on. Are there any medical or mental health issues that need to be addressed? These sorts of things that could potentially keep somebody from, feeling that God is comforting them, or from having that experience. Given that, myself and a lot of other people I've talked to would say, when I was really struggling, it really did feel that God was there for us in that particular, in some particular way. And I think that I agree, of course, with Alex that the theist is committed to saying that no matter what, no matter what suffering or how gratuitous it seems to us, there would have to be some purpose to it. But I think the naturalist is also committed to saying there is no teleology, there's no purpose to any suffering, and as a result, there is no point to it. And if you take the whole theistic picture, it's not just that suffering here serves a purpose in this life, but perhaps if you take John Hick's view, the sort of soul-making theodicity, perhaps it builds strength, or all of these wrongs are going to be righted in the next life. So I think it's important to take the existence of suffering on the terms of, the whole picture of what's being proposed with theism. And then we get to an interesting point that I want to make, which is under naturalism, our moral beliefs are kind of debunked to a certain point. So Kai Nielsen, in his book Ethics Without God, says, it is more reasonable to believe that such elemental things, and the examples he gives is wife beating or child abuse, are evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his moral beliefs. I find this to be really interesting because personally I believe that naturalism does lead to the sort of moral nihilism that Kai Nielsen is talking about. And thus, I think Kai Nielsen, even though, in his book Ethics Without God, would thus be more reasonable to reject naturalism, given, and this is given more contemporary work, people like Richard Joyce, who I've been in contact with, and Sharon Street's really influential paper about evolutionary debunking arguments for moral realism that says we cannot know or reasonably believe that any such things are wrong. You can, of course, follow Mackey's argument from queerness. These are all kind of more modern versions of the same sort of thing. And yeah, I would just, this is my point, right? Naturalism suggests that such things are not wrong. And any of our propositions about these things being wrong are ultimately illusory. Me believing that, child beating or child abuse is wrong is debunked under naturalism, because that is not the kind of, wrongness is not the kind of thing that is compatible with a naturalist epistemology or ontology. Or at least that's the argument that I have sort of made in my papers and these sorts of things. And I think this kind of brings about a really interesting point. So we can claim that we create meaning in our own lives. And I know in the discussion that William Lane Craig had with Shelley Kagan, they were both kind of going around this point where Kagan was saying, yeah, well, it's not meaningless to me that I can just live a meaningful life and I create this meaning in my own life and I die. Like, it doesn't have to have some sort of like cosmic meaning. And my response to this is, yes, but you're always confronted with the absurdity of the fact that you are creating this meaning from something that is ultimately not meaningful. And you are obviously living a delusion if you think that your moral truths or your moral propositions have any sort of cosmic value or worth. Now, you may say, okay, it doesn't need to have any cosmic worth to be meaningful to me. And that's sort of fair, right? But the naturalist who is asking the theist to abandon theism because theism is a fantasy are asking them to buy into another fantasy, namely that such things that they really deeply believe are wrong are actually not wrong, but yet you're going to continue believing as if such things are wrong. Or sorry, you continue living as if such things are wrong, even though you don't actually believe them to be the case. And I think that's where the absurdity comes in. It's basically, you realize you are living a lie. You are not only living a lie, but you are behaving irrationally under your ontology and epistemology. And yet you are committed to continue doing this if you want to act as if such things are actually wrong. And this creates an even bigger problem when you try to convince other people, because you're now convincing other people to behave a certain way in accordance with principles you don't believe exist, and you also believe you cannot give them an actual reason. So other people are always ends to your own means. And that's the point Alistair McIntyre makes in After Virtues. Others are always ends under any sort of form where there's no sort of moral ontology out there, because what you're doing is you're trying to get them to change their behavior in accordance with principles you don't actually believe exist in the first place. So there's no way of convincing other people. And yet, I'm sure the people that make these sorts of claims would certainly object if someone found meaning torturing them. And this was a point, actually, I talked to a philosophy professor at my university, and it's really interesting. She was a naturalist, and we were talking about Mackie, and I was kind of telling her, yeah, I've been talking with these people who don't actually believe in moral realism and like are kind of moral nihilists in this sort of way. And her response was, well, what would happen if you just like poured a bunch of hot coals on their head? Wouldn't they obviously object? And I'm like, I think they would be unhappy with it, but I don't know if they would have the sort of capacity. And we were kind of talking about this. Could they actually say that what was being done was wrong or was objectively wrong? And I think this goes kind of back to Kai Nelson's point. It's like, obviously, when you're in that position, you're going to be like, no, there has to be something wrong with this. You really have to do some level of, I think, in my opinion, mental gymnastics to accept the sort of moral nihilism that naturalism implies. And that's why, at least I would ask the naturalist who claims belief in moral realism, do you at least understand? Do you at least understand why, to me as a theist, such things look like special pleading, right? Why it's like, okay, your epistemology for the existence of God is explained away by evolutionary debunking arguments, and we can explain all of these without God needing to exist. Okay, great, but what about your belief in moral principles or some sort of value in human life outside of what you or I think about it? How is that not also similarly debunked under the same arguments you give for debunking religious belief, like the ones that Alex gives? And I think that gets to this point where it's like, do you at least understand why I would be skeptical of the moral realism under naturalism? And if that's the case, then the response, as Kai Nelson would argue, would be just rejecting naturalism altogether, because it implies some conclusion that we just know isn't true. We just know. And once again, now you're getting into epistemology, because you're just saying, I know deep down that that's much more true than any sort of theory based on provisional results that's not even maybe even scientific. It's maybe backed by scientific sounding arguments, but it's not scientific in any sense of described by philosophy of science. So anyway, those are the points that I wanted to make. Hopefully you found this helpful, and hopefully this has at least got people thinking and will lead to a more productive discussion in the future. Yeah, we're having fun here. So thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.